Good evening, and welcome to the Oxford University Holocaust Memorial Lecture Series 2022, part of the Humanities Cultural Programme funded by the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities. Each year on Holocaust Memorial Day, the 27th of January, we come together to remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust and the millions of people who've suffered under the Nazi persecution of other groups and have been killed in the subsequent genocides of Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. The theme for Holocaust Memorial Day 2022 is One Day, a theme that encourages us to think about the individual days in history that hold extreme significance, the days when life changed for victims of genocide, and the day in the future without genocide to which we all strive. But one day also acts as a somber reminder that a day will come when Holocaust survivors are no longer around to share their powerful testimonies with us. On this day, it will fall to us to tell their stories. Because although 77 years after the Holocaust, its history and memory remain important for our society that faces rising antisemitism, contemporary genocide, and international humanitarian crises. On Holocaust Memorial Day, we learn and reflect on the Holocaust, encouraging us to consider what we want our common future to look like. This series, aware that one day survivors will not be around to tell their stories, asserts the responsibility of younger generations like those of us here at the university to carry forward their memory. Today, we come together to consider remembering the Holocaust in the UK, the challenges and opportunities. Commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day has become a significant event in the UK's calendar, with civic, religious and political leaders coming together every year in remembrance, and with thousands of events happening across the country to mark the day. The launch of the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation and the building of a UK Holocaust Memorial in Victoria Tower Gardens in London seeks to embed Holocaust remembrance and education at the very heart of UK civic life. Today in this event, we will hear Holocaust Educational Trust Regional Ambassador Eloise Bishop in conversation with the project historian for the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, Martin Winstone, to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities facing remembrance in the UK. Leading the discussion is Eloise Bishop. Eloise is in her second year as an undergraduate history student at the University of Glasgow. She's a regional ambassador for the Holocaust Educational Trust and now holds various positions within third sector organisations and youth media outlets. She's passionate about human rights and genocide prevention, and works to ensure that young people's voices are heard. Joining her is Martin Winstone. Martin is the Senior Historical Advisor for the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation. Senior Historical Advisor for the Holocaust Educational Trust and Project Historian for the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation. He's the author of books about the Holocaust, including The Holocaust Sites of Europe and Historical Guide. Martin and Eloise, it's a pleasure to have you both with us today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Barnabas, and thank you for inviting myself and Martin to have such an important conversation about Holocaust remembrance and memorialisation. It's an absolute honour to be here, even if it's only virtually. So we've heard a little bit about what we're going to talk about, but I think where I would like to start is why and how did you first get involved in Holocaust remembrance, and why is it important to you, Martin?
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you to Barnabas and to the team from Torch for organising this evening and for everyone else to joining us. There's potentially quite a long answer to that question, which I don't want to give, as this may shock some of our participants, but I am in my 50s. And so it's been quite a long road to get to this point. But for the last 15 years or so, in one way or another, I've been involved in this field of Holocaust education and remembrance. And I think, like a lot of people in the field, there's a mixture of, I suppose, a sort of intellectual interest in this period of history. When I was at school in the 1980s, hardly anyone was taught about the Holocaust. And even when I was a student within the old Oxford history degree, the only 20th century history that I did was in the old English 3 paper, which some of our audience may be familiar with. So it's not something that I learned about formally, but increasingly, particularly through teaching, I found myself dealing with it. And I've always been interested in, especially the history of Eastern Europe, of Poland, the former Soviet Union. And the more one studies that history, the more one understands just how fundamental the Holocaust is and the rupture that it represents in the history of the whole continent, but I think particularly of the east of the continent. So over time, I had a sort of growing interest, as I say, at a sort of intellectual level, but I think also, like a lot of people in working in this area, there's a sort of personal dimension to this as well. Now, as far as I'm aware, I mean, there's nobody in my family who was directly involved with this history, but certainly that's the case with my partner's family. And almost 20 years ago, we went on a holiday to the Baltic states, including to what today is Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, historically Vilna, a Polish city, and that's where her great-grandparents came from. Like many Eastern European Jews, they came to the UK at the end of the 19th century. And first of all, visiting the city and visiting the Panari forest outside the city, where one of the largest and most important Jewish communities in Europe was destroyed, was itself a very powerful experience. But I think also when we returned, it led to sort of sharing of memories within her family. And I don't know if anyone of our audience have read Daniel Mendelssohn's book, The Lost, which I would really recommend if you haven't. This sort of quest to find a lost family. And there were sort of elements of that incredible serendipity, which led to us not just making contact with relatives we already knew about in the UK, but across the world, which is very common with Eastern European Jewish families. But also, as we learned more about all of these different branches in America and Australia and Argentina and South Africa, also learning more about the people who stayed. And this realization that dozens, in fact hundreds of members of this family were murdered. And I think that sort of personal connection, which might come through something like that, it might come, I think, for many people from hearing a Holocaust survivor speak, from the experience which I know you, Eloise, and Barnabas have both had of visiting Auschwitz and seeing the physicality of the Holocaust. I think a personal dimension is often something that really inspires people, and certainly that was the case for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, for me, going to Auschwitz and also visiting Sachsenhausen is something that is very important to me and is the reason behind a lot of everything else that I do. And I think it's something that sticks with a lot of people. I think what I'd love to know is kind of what then kind of made you take kind of all of that and your personal experiences and made you want to kind of put that energy into the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation.
Sure, thank you. So as I said, I mean, I've been working in this field for many years, writing books, working for the Holocaust Educational Trust in one form or another for more than a decade now. But when this opportunity came along, I think, I mean, there are a number of things at a slightly egotistical level. It is an incredible opportunity and a privilege, I think, to be involved in a project of this sort. I mean, it is not very often that a nation takes a decision to create a Holocaust memorial. I mean, we'll maybe talk a bit more about the mechanics of that in due course, but it is a momentous moment in Holocaust memory within the UK. And as Barnabas said, at the cusp of a period where it's beginning to fade from living memory, sadly. So the opportunity to be involved in shaping the form that this would take is a really huge honor, I think, and a huge responsibility. And I think also, I mean, it's fair to say for a lot of people who were involved in this field in some way or another, in the early years of this project, I think there was a lot of uncertainty about what it would actually be, because understandably the Memorial Foundation had to focus on what its mission was, what site it was going to use, what the memorial would be, to find a design and so on. And so it took a while for clarity about what the content and the message of it was going to be. But I think that's a really inspiring thing. When when I became involved with this, I mean, it was made very clear, as many of our audience may know, the chairs of the co-chairs of the foundation are Lord Pickles and Ed Balls, and Lord Pickles is also the head of the UK's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IRA, which I'm also a member of. And sadly, one of the things that we often have to deal with within IRA is Holocaust distortion. Not people denying the Holocaust, but people in some way presenting less than the whole truth about that in all sorts of different ways. And sadly, sometimes governments engage in that. And there are some very prominent examples in various parts of Europe today. And one of the things that really struck with me, which Lord Pickles said when I sort of began to get involved with this, and which he said publicly since, is, we cannot criticize other countries for how they approach their history if we are not honest about our own. And I think that's a really important part of this project, and something that really attracted me to it. Not to say Britain is terrible or that Britain is amazing, but just to try to look at history honestly. And I think in the process to actually touch on a lot of issues and to uncover a lot of history that most people just really don't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just before we started, Barnabas and I were talking about how history is not really ours to pass judgment on. The Holocaust is, when you kind of delve beneath the surface, actually quite a grey area. And, on the surface, of course, it's this great bad and this kind of great good. But the second you kind of even scratch the surface, actually, there is a lot of nuance and a lot of very complicated history that you've kind of got to contend with. And I guess this is something that you're dealing with a lot as part of your role in this. And I was wondering kind of how do you deal with that when you're kind of working within this role?
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge challenge. And as I say, a responsibility. And I think it's both the fact that, as you say, absolutely, the Holocaust is an incredibly complex event, which often is presented in quite stark and simplistic terms or oversimplistic terms. And we have to be aware of those complexities and nuances. And we have an academic advisory board to rightly, including Barnabas's supervisor, Zoe Waxman, who I should mention, who are there to remind us of that. At the same time, the challenge with creating with a project like this, so essentially, the memorial comes with an exhibition, and that's primarily what I'm working on. The exhibition that people will see when they enter into the memorial, as it were, they go downstairs. And we have to acknowledge that there are incredibly varying levels of knowledge about the Holocaust. I think most people in the UK have sort of top level knowledge, but a lot of the detail and certainly the complexity they maybe are not aware of. So how you, first of all, shape a narrative for an exhibition, and how you do so in a way which is accessible to the very diverse audience that we aspire to attract, is a real challenge. And it's one where I'm not sure there's a perfect answer. I think every Holocaust museum that one goes to, even if one goes to, or memorial, if one goes to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which is the world's largest Holocaust memorial institution and museum, and talk to people at Yad Vashem, it's an incredibly detailed exhibition, but there are still things that there are people who really regret that they were never able to include in there. So part of my role is working within the curatorial teams with the chief curator and with others to work out what is our narrative and what are the examples that we're using for each stage in the narrative, because for every point that we want to address, every nuance that we want to engage with, there are lots of potential stories and examples that one could use, and you can't, sadly, with the best will in the world, you can't use all of them. So the process of creating an exhibition is as much about exclusion as it is inclusion, and that's really tough. And I think it's, all I can say is, we endeavour to do our best and to make sure that as many perspectives as possible are represented. And then, of course, comes the extra challenge of how do you then turn this vision of what your content is going to be into three-dimensional space. I mean, I'm sure many viewers this evening have been to the new Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum. And I know James Bulgin, the curator of the exhibition, well. And over the years, I've seen James deliver his PowerPoints many times. So, you know, I've known at a sort of basic level what this is going to be, but still visualizing that as an actual physical space is a very, very different thing. And so, you know, when you actually go there, you think, well, oh, now I see what you mean. Or I didn't quite expect it was going to look like that. So it keeps us busy, essentially. And I think, as I say, there is a very strong awareness from everybody involved that, you know, memorials can go very badly wrong. And there are some examples in certain parts of the world today, some very controversial examples of memorials which have been created or are in the process of being created. And so we constantly have to have that in mind.
Yeah, just before we kind of keep going, just to say that if anyone has any questions, we will be taking them at the end, and please put them into the Q&A box down below at the bottom of your screens. Yeah, I've been to many of the exhibitions. I haven't been to the new one at the Imperial War Museum yet, but I've been to the kind of original one there. And I think a lot of people kind of interact with the history kind of in that way, and in that very physical way of moving through an environment. What do you think is going to separate this memorial from the other ones that exist in the UK?
Sure. I think it's a number of things, and you know, we need to, and I'm glad that you referred to memorials, because I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that this, you know, there are a variety of institutions in the UK. There is, of course, the Imperial War Museum. We also, in a number of places around the country, in Nottinghamshire, in Huddersfield, very recently in Glasgow, there are wonderful institutions which are doing incredible work in remembrance and education. And then there are lots of physical memorials, ranging from you know, little blue plaques on the side of buildings to more substantial structures. But I think, you know, what we're doing is actually, in a way, is a number of things which are different. The first I've already alluded to, in the sense that our focus is on Britain's relationship with the Holocaust, which I think is a really important thing, because it's something that tends to get overlooked. Certainly when I was growing up, there was always this sense that, you know, the Second World War was quite a simple story as far as Britain was concerned. We were the goodies. I mean, this is when I was a kid, and they were the baddies, and we had a good war, and that's broadly it. And I think that idea is still there at some sort of elemental level in a lot of British consciousness. And as far as, you know, the Holocaust didn't necessarily figure in that perception, but insofar as it did, it's essentially, it happened over there. And again, we were the goodies. We liberated Belsen. And you know, before there was ever the Holocaust exhibition at the IWM, there used to be this little sort of slightly, almost like curtained off area, this hidden area where there was footage of Belsen, and that was how the Holocaust was addressed. And I think, you know, historians have always known this, but I think even then, I've been surprised, as the more that I've done with this project, in terms of just how much this is a part of British history. And we are going to tell the wider story of the Holocaust, but through a British perspective, because part of the story is just how much was known. That you can look, for example, at newspaper reports from 1942, and almost every aspect of the Holocaust that you can think of is reported in the British press. And largely coming through the Polish underground, through its emissaries who were coming to London. And also, it was Britain that was telling the world about the Holocaust, because the BBC was the main source for people, particularly in occupied Europe, was the main source of information for millions of people. And there's a whole debate about, you know, whether the BBC could have said more and so on. But first of all, it was known, and it impacted upon our politics. It impacted upon communities across the UK. And I think that's something we really want to get across. This is not just about the British state and its responses. The impact of the Holocaust was felt in communities all over the country, whether it was through the arrival of refugees, whether it's through the internment of many of those refugees in 1940, through British soldiers who in some way or another were encountering the Holocaust and returned to their hometowns and villages after the war. And I think actually something that really, really struck me many years ago during the development of this process, when I think most of our audience will know, but maybe if they don't, perhaps I should explain, that the Memorial Project arose out of what was called the Prime Minister's Holocaust Commission, which was established by David Cameron to look into the future of Holocaust education and remembrance in the UK. And obviously a lot has changed since David Cameron was Prime Minister. But during the days when the Commission was doing its work, I remember there was a public event at the Jewish Museum in Camden where the late Professor David Cesarani, Britain's leading historian of the Holocaust, spoke. And he was talking about, what is Britain's relationship with the Holocaust? And one of the points that David really stressed, which I think most people don't realise, which again goes back to what I was saying about my partner's family earlier, is that nearly all British Jews lost members of their family in the Holocaust. Given that most British Jews were descended from Eastern European immigrants, and there tended to be very large families, we are talking about vast numbers, vast loss of siblings, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins, sometimes parents. And if hundreds of thousands of British citizens lose each, or often lose, at least dozens of members of their family, that in itself is a huge impact. So I think one of the things that we will be hoping to do is to bring through this British dimension, as I say, in lots of ways that people won't expect. And I think also one of the interesting things about this project is because this is a new development, unlike existing institutions like the IWM, like the Wiener Holocaust Library in Russell Square, which is the oldest and still in certain respects most important institution engaged in Holocaust remembrance in the UK. We don't have a collection of physical artifacts. So a decision was made quite early on that it would be really a bit fatuous to try and replicate what others are doing. So also the approach that we will be taking to the exhibition is, rather than having physical objects, is much more to use images, sound. Images could be photographs or film, art, which actually, when we're dealing with 20th century history, has a really powerful impact, I think, on people. And there are extraordinary materials that we've sourced during the research process over the last couple of years. I mean, particularly, audio. There is incredible material out there which hardly anybody knows exists. So what I hope very much is that the memorial will be able to sit in a position where it complements the work of existing institutions, each of whom are offering something distinctive. Because I think the example of other countries, like Germany or the Netherlands or Poland, or the United States. I mean, there are hundreds, literally, of Holocaust-related memorials and museums in the US, shows that it's possible for institutions to coexist and to work with each other in hopefully a very meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you say kind of audio history, because I think a lot of us kind of think of it in kind of very kind of visual terms, in terms of very famous iconography, and kind of then in kind of statistical terms and artifacts. One of the things you're kind of most confronted by when you visit a camp like Auschwitz is the bowls and the very famous shoes and all of these things that I think really stand out. But actually also one of, in at least British consciousness, is kind of one of the most famous things is, of course, Richard Dimbleby's report on the liberation of Belsen. And I almost don't think of it necessarily instantly, even though it's something that I'm very aware of. And I think it's interesting that you talk about that, because I don't think it's something that necessarily most of us would instantly go to.
Indeed. And I think actually, Dimbleby is actually, within our field, is relatively well known. There is extraordinary stuff out there, which in some cases, I think no one has listened to for 75 years. And I'm not at the moment able to say what this is, but there is incredible material. And I think, obviously, one of the reasons why people use objects in museums is the authenticity that an object has. And I think that's absolutely correct. But I think when we're dealing with the 20th century, the age of the mass media, then also sound and film have a huge authenticity as well. And actually, when we think about the Holocaust, as you say, so much of it is visual. And it's probably particularly in photographs. But I think, in some ways, that's still an area where, I mentioned Yad Vashem earlier, and, you know, people who work at Yad Vashem have a massive photo archive, and, you know, they all know what are, as it were, the iconic images, but still there are so many images there that they've still never been fully explored. So there are always new things that we can find, and I very much hope that's what we will be able to contribute towards.
What then are kind of the difficulties of presenting something like audio testimony? It's not as simple as simply putting it on a display.
Indeed. I mean, it's what you, it's how you contextualize it, what you use it with. And so it would, you know, it makes sense in certain instances to combine it with visuals. So you mentioned the Dimbleby broadcast, and, you know, I'm not giving too much away to say the Dimbleby broadcast will be used in this exhibition. And, you know, that we're all aware that there are certain images from Belsen which tend to naturally connect with that, and they have to be used sensitively and carefully. But I think it's about, yeah, it's always about ensuring that the visitor knows what this thing is, what it represents. And sometimes it will be evident from what the person is saying. In other cases, it needs some sort of context. But I think one of the great things, you know, this has been a bit of a crash course in museology. And one of the, you know, the really striking developments in museum practice in recent years is just, and we're still only beginning to tap into this, is the realization of what you can do with digital, not in the sense of using, you know, because digital is something somehow that young people will naturally gravitate towards, but just what technology allows you to do in terms of how you use sound, how and how you manage sound in different places, how you use, yeah, how you project onto a wall, that sort of thing. And it also, to an extent, gives you a flexibility, because it's a bit of a cliche. Not just within this field, but I think within museology generally, the exhibitions have a lifespan of about 20 to 25 years. So Auschwitz is currently changing its permanent exhibition, most of which was created in the 1990s. So, you know, using digital projections particularly gives you the opportunity to make changes as you go along, as new evidence is found. So, for example, I can say one thing that we're planning to do within the exhibition, which deviates a little from your original question about audio, but I think is one of the most powerful things that we will be doing, which virtually nobody is aware of. Approximately 700 British Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And this is an almost entirely unknown history. Mostly people who were born in the UK, who for some reason or other, maybe because they got married, because they got a job, ended up settling elsewhere in Europe. And then when the war broke out, maybe they didn't have, in theory, a British passport should have given you protection from murder, but maybe they couldn't find it, or some other circumstances came in. And I think this is something that's going to be really moving to people, but not just to see the names of these people, but to see where they were from. We'll highlight a couple of these stories. I mean, there's one in particular which is just heartbreaking. But when we do this, we know there might be other people who come forward and say, well, actually, there's this member of my family who was born in Leeds, and we know that this happened to him in somewhere in Europe. And so it gives the opportunity to adapt as you go along, to take on board new research, new stories. So I hope, you know, I really want to stress, it's not going to be a sort of all singing, all dancing exhibition for the sake of it, but sensitive use of technology in all its forms gives us the opportunity to do some really quite innovative things, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be amazing, and I can't wait, you know, for it to finally be complete and to go and visit it. Actually, kind of moving on to that, like, why do you think it's kind of important that this memorial is in Westminster over maybe anywhere else?
I've realised that's a sensitive question for some people, so I don't want to say that this is the only site that it could have been, but I mean, you know, sites in central London where you can put a significant memorial are relatively limited. But I think I'd say a couple of things. I mean, one which is really interesting, and I was doing a public event a couple of days ago, and I mentioned this then, so I apologise to anyone in the audience who has already heard me say this. In 1979, when the Board of Deputies of British Jews first approached the government with the proposal for a National Holocaust Memorial, They suggested a site in Westminster, literally on the other side of the road from Victoria Tower Gardens. And at that stage, the government said no, essentially, I mean, it's a slightly long story, but essentially on the grounds that this would be a memorial for the Jewish community. So the state should not be expected to be responsible for this, or to pay for it, or to look after it. This, this was at a time of the National Front and widespread anti-Semitism. So it's quite a normal concept to have a Holocaust memorial in proximity to the seat of power. It's the case in Berlin, most obviously. It's the case in Washington, DC. It's the case in Budapest. So I think it, in some ways, it's saying something about the importance of the Holocaust in national memory by placing it somewhere central. But I think also Westminster is a central, Westminster and Whitehall are a central part of this story in multiple ways. As I said earlier, the extent to which the Holocaust permeated British history is largely unknown. This was something that was frequently debated, discussed, often very angrily in Parliament. One of the very first things I did when I started researching on this project was to go through Hansard and to copy all of the debates which in some way were relevant between 1933 up to about 1948-49, and put them into a Word document, and that came to 3.5 million words. It's, I mean, almost broke my computer. It's the biggest Word document I've ever come across. And it takes, it takes 10 minutes to properly open. MPs thought this mattered. Some MPs particularly. And in the House of Commons, in the House of Lords, it was a topic of huge importance. And MPs of all parties and none took a stand on this issue. And actually in the House of Lords, some of the people who took the clearest stance against the Holocaust were people like William Temple, who was the Archbishop of York and later the Archbishop of Canterbury. Lord Samuel, the former leader of the Liberal Party, former Home Secretary. And so in that sense, it mattered to parliamentarians in the 1940s. And but I think also, it encourages us to ask questions about fundamentally, what are the roles and responsibilities of government and legislatures? And the Holocaust, I think, is a very powerful case study of what governments can do and what they can't do. But I think also, as I said earlier, this is not just the history of high politics, of states, of governments. And I think what's a really important point that comes out of this is we don't want people to go away thinking, weren't the politicians terrible? Because I think there may be individual politicians who one could say were terrible, but I think there's the interaction with public opinion. And just finally to give an example of the power of Parliament is, I mentioned earlier the question of internment in 1940. So when the war broke out, the government took what I think was a very fair and far-sighted approach, which was basically to say we made a mistake in the First World War with the indiscriminate internment of German citizens. We're not going to make that mistake again, not least because most of the German citizens and Austrian citizens in the UK are refugees from Nazism. So we're only going to intern the people that we think are the Nazis. And whether or not the right decisions were always made is a question, but broadly they tried to be fair. And then in the invasion panic in the spring of 1940, the government basically gave in to public opinion, egged on by most, not quite all of the press, which basically said, lock them all up. And so it's, in a way, it's essentially the British public who don't come out of that particular story especially well. And it was actually parliamentarians who ensured that this grave injustice was actually addressed. It was, again, Lords and MPs from all parties who campaigned against this and forced the government relatively quickly to back down and release many of those people, those Jews and socialist refugees who'd found themselves stuck on the Isle of Man. So I think, Parliament is central to this story. And Westminster is central to this story. As I say, it's not just about London, but there's a symbolic importance in having it here, and also it links very much with the history of the building, which will be hopefully adjacent to it.
Yeah, you know, because of course, you know, I'm up in Glasgow and, you know, I am in London sometimes, but, you know, it's not something that necessarily everyone will be able to access in person. So how can people across the UK, how will they be able to interact with this and benefit from it?
Sure. I think there's a number of ways. I mean, one is, like any institution of this sort, the memorial will have a physical presence, but it will hopefully have a wider presence as well. And in due course, I think particularly it will have an online presence, which will enable people to interact with so some of the content of the exhibit, to learn more about it and to explore it in greater depth, even if they have visited. So, for example, with these British victims of the Holocaust, we can only, because of space and time and so on, you have to think about how you move visitors around and make sure they don't all get stuck in one place. We can only tell maybe 2 or 3 individual stories in detail. Through a website, people will be able to learn more about this. So there's that dimension to it, in the same way that other similar institutions in other countries have this wider presence. Secondly, I think, and I can't prejudge anything here, but I think there's a very strong desire from all involved for cooperation between different institutions. I mentioned particularly in different regions of the UK, there are institutions engaged in Holocaust education and remembrance. And I think, I think one of the really encouraging things about this project is just how much support there is for it within the field of Holocaust education and remembrance, and a willingness for people to work together. I mean, it often surprises people who don't work in this field, which after all is most people, because it's a pretty odd field to be working in, just how many organisations there are. And there are very good reasons why they all exist, but people often get confused about them. But I think generally they work together, and I really hope this project will act as a catalyst to encourage further cooperation within the field. And then also, I think, as I said, what we want to do is to encourage people to learn more about how this is a part of their history, not just the history of Britain, but the history of their communities, of their localities, in some cases their families. And what I hope is, both through the exhibit itself, but also through the wider presence the memorial will have, that people will be inspired to begin to learn more about the Holocaust in their areas. I mean, I found working in education, this is always an incredibly powerful thing. When people maybe discover, I mean, Glasgow is a really good example. I mean, you've got a whole load of sites in Glasgow, which, you've got the Garnet Hill Synagogue in Glasgow, which is a centre for all sorts of things. Adjacent to it was a hostel for refugees who came on the Kinder transport. You have other places in Glasgow where refugees were held when they were arrested in 1940. So I think, the more people engage with their own communal histories, I think the more they really feel just how much this history matters and how it connects to them. And actually, I think it fits in as well with some of the changes which are beginning to happen in education in the UK, which obviously have mixed and they vary from nation to nation, but there's a growing emphasis on local history. And actually, even before the events of the last couple of years, within the school system in England, where there are maybe quite a lot of issues with how history is taught, but schools have the option for the history GCSE to do papers on migration through British history and linking that to local history. And this is a part of it, because there are all sorts of weird connections between these stories. And sorry to go on for so long, but I just give one more example. I mentioned British victims of the Holocaust. Amongst them were 2 brothers who were born in Manchester in the early 20th century, and their family moved to Norway, and they ended up living in Tromsø in northern Norway. And these 2 brothers were deported to their deaths in Auschwitz in 1942. And so they were sent down to Oslo, taken by sea from Oslo to Germany, and then put on trains to Auschwitz. The boat that carried them from Oslo to Germany was a boat called the Monte Rosa, which after the war, the British took as spoils of war, and they renamed as the Empire Windrush. And so, it's a complete coincidence, but you have these sort of weird intersections of different moments in the story of migration to and from this country, which I think are really fascinating. So I think, this, as I say, in many ways, I hope is a catalyst for all sorts of other things and will stimulate more research and more interest in these areas.
Yeah, I actually sat a migration to Britain paper at GCSE.
Fantastic.
So yeah, it's, you know, and you're kind of encouraged to look at a very specific place and look at kind of migration in that area. And, you know, I know that it's something that kind of was very interesting to me. And I know a lot of people, you know, are engaging more and more with their own local histories. And one of the things that was great this year at the Scottish National Ceremony for Holocaust Memorial Day was getting to hear the testimony of Henry Wooger, who was a refugee who arrived here with his wife Ingrid. And, you know, it's so wonderful to kind of engage with someone who is from your community and to hear that story. And I think it does kind of really help with kind of being able to empathize and engage with that history. And I think, you know, that will be something that will really come across in this memorial. And I think that will help a lot of people to be able to engage with it on maybe a deeper level than they would have otherwise. And that actually leads me quite nicely on to what was my final question before maybe we can take some questions from the floor, which was, of course, we are tragically losing more and more survivors and people who can tell their stories each year. How will the memorial and how does Holocaust education more generally adapt to this and play a part in ensuring that those stories can continue to be told?
Sure. I mean, it is obviously a huge challenge. I mean, it's a challenge that we've known would always happen. I think in a way, it gives, you know, we are entering this era where sadly survivors are passing away. At the same time, though, I think, you know, actually, it's a moment for reflection. I mean, as some attendees will be aware, last week Freddie Noller died at the age of 100, and Freddie had the most extraordinary life. I mean, packed in enough for 200 years in his time. But the fact that he lived to be 100, I think, is, yeah, in and of itself shouldn't be remarkable, but given what he went through, I think is an extraordinary thing, which actually in a way we should celebrate. And I think there's something quite touching about the fact that, you know, so many survivors have been able to stay with us for so long and to have done so much. But we shouldn't expect that to be the whole burden of telling people about the Holocaust, as Barnabas alluded to earlier. I mean, there's responsibility for later generations. And I think there are a number of things. I mean, obviously survivor stories will remain with us in certain ways. Yeah, we, with the memorial, have a collection of testimonies, 112 testimonies that were recorded. And, you know, many of the people who recorded those testimonies have since died, sadly. And we, you know, there are other archives out there. The largest archive, of course, is the Shoah Foundation. If you were to never go to sleep or eat or go to the bathroom, it would take you more than 13 years to watch all of the testimonies in the Shoah Foundation. So we have testimonies, but we know it won't be the same. So we have to think of ways of preserving not just the memory of the survivors, but I think actually in a way, the passing of survivors will slightly refocus how we think about the Holocaust, because actually when we hear a survivor, we're not just hearing their story, we're hearing the story of their family. And I think, so, you know, in Freddie's case, he survived, his brother survived, but we learn about his parents. And that I think is something that actually people will increasingly focus on, and the voices of the victims where they exist, where victims left us, writings, poems, whatever. So I think that will come to be a part of it as well. But it goes back to also, I think, to something we mentioned earlier, which is the idea of authentic experiences or encounters. And sadly, one will never be able to have that in person again. But as I say, you know, many survivors have dedicated decades of their lives to share their experiences. So they will form a part of this in some way or another going forward. But also I think this actually makes both authentic sites, and authentic Holocaust sites is a very broad term, it doesn't just mean killing sites, having a huge importance going forward, and memorials and museums as well. And it's never going to be the same. I think we can see that with the First World War. Now that the First World War has pretty definitively passed out of living memory for virtually everybody, we don't engage with it in quite the same way that we did. And sadly, that's just the nature of history. But I think the Holocaust is such a documented event, and with so many people and organizations dedicated to preserving its memory, and so many people like yourself and Barnabas who are engaged in this, then I think we know it will be different, but I think we can ensure that these memories are preserved.
Absolutely, and it's so important that we do. So I'm going to start taking some questions that we've been sent in. So the first one we have is from Isabel Mutton, and she asks, are there any examples of memorials and memorial museums around the world that have particularly inspired the UK HMF? I
would say yes, and I'd say in a couple of ways. In terms of the delivery, I think I mentioned earlier that there's going to be a sort of strong audio-visual component to this, and I would say, well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that our chief curator, Yehudit Shendar, used to work for Yad Vashem. She's the former deputy head of the museum division at Yad Vashem. So obviously she comes from the Yad Vashem background, but I think particularly as a reference point for people who've been to Auschwitz, the Block 27 exhibit created in Auschwitz I, which replaced the shameful communist era Jews block that had been there since the 1970s. It's by no means the same, but there are certain similarities there. And I think you will have been there, and Barnabas, Eloise, when the first room in Block 27 is this incredible experience where you go into a room where you're just surrounded by ever-changing footage of pre-war Jewish life, and there's music and voices, and it is just one of the most incredible things. So I think in that sense, in terms of delivery, it's not necessarily been directly the template, but it's been something we had in mind, the power, not in the whole exhibition, but in certain segments of that approach to have an impact. But I think also in a slightly different way, in terms of focusing on this history, as we mentioned earlier, with the nuances, with objectivity. There are a lot of museums around the world which approach the Holocaust, insofar as it's possible, with that very much in mind. So, for example, if you go to Budapest, where there is a very contentious Holocaust memorial culture, and has been for very many years under the present Hungarian government, you have the Holocaust Memorial Centre in a former synagogue on Pava Street in Budapest. And this is an old exhibition. It's more than almost 20 years old now. It makes some choices about lighting and the bulk of text that wouldn't necessarily be made today. But what it does is to address the history of this period very, very honestly, which is why the present Hungarian government isn't a particularly big fan of this exhibition. And similarly, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I guess alongside Yad Vashem is sort of seen as the two top institutions in the field presently. The USHMM currently has had on for a couple of years now this supposedly temporary exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust, which is looking at, in a way that the USHMM maybe didn't originally. I mean, there's an American thread that runs through the permanent exhibition. It's maybe slightly saying we're the good guys. And this is a much more nuanced interrogation of American reaction. So I think that, so there's the conceptual in terms of how you present this, but also in terms of how you're dealing with very difficult histories, which I think may lead us into the next question.
I think it does quite perfectly. And that question is, how will the memorial treat the British decision to close British Mandate Palestine to refugees in the 1930s? Yeah,
it will treat it. And I think it is a complex issue, but I think we want people to be aware that, Britain, and this is why it's part of British history, because when we talk about Britain in the 1930s, we are not talking about an island that is somehow cut off from the rest of the world. We are talking about the country which controlled a quarter of the world, including Mandate Palestine. And I think it's a really interesting story that initially, until the Arab uprising in the mid-30s, British policy was essentially to say, we're not going to let Jews into Britain, not going to let very many, but we will let them into Palestine. So initially, there was a move to allow quite significant numbers of German Jews into Palestine, and more went there than anywhere else in the world up to 1935. But from that point onwards, the gates got narrower and narrower until when the war broke out, they pretty much closed completely. And it's not just an issue in the 1930s, it's also an issue after the war, because the fundamental question that has to be addressed is, what did Britain do with the survivors? There were very large numbers of survivors in the British zone of Germany, particularly in the Belsen DP camp, displaced persons camp. What do you do with these people? Britain didn't show any great willingness to allow them into Britain. It didn't show a great willingness to allow them into Palestine earlier, which makes it a very complicated history. So again, what we have to try to do here is to tell this story in a nuanced way. And I think the easiest way to do that, and this is part of the approach, is not for us as an institution to editorialize and to say, this is what they should have done, or they got this right and they got that wrong, because that's not what the role of honest curators should be. But we can use the words from the time. And, I say, the 3.5 million words generated in Hansard, a lot of those words were about Palestine, both in the 1930s and all the way through, because even during the Second World War, there were debates about whether or not, Jews who were in Poland couldn't get to Palestine, but Jews who say were in Romania or Bulgaria, or even for part of the war in Hungary, could potentially get to Palestine. And Britain did everything it could to try to stop them. And we're obviously aware that this whole history of the British Mandate beyond the Holocaust is a hugely contentious story. So all I can say is try to address it as fairly, as sensitively as possible. But it's a part of the story that that has to be told. And I think it's again, it's one where people will come to various conclusions.
Absolutely, and I think it's excellent that the memorial is going to contend with these very difficult topics and kind of, I guess, trust people that they will be able to kind of handle the nuance of it. Next question is kind of, how would you respond to the criticism that the Cambridge historian of the Second World War, Sir Richard Evans, has made of the memorial? Which is, I think there's criticism around kind of national, international embarrassment compared to other memorials.
I think it's a challenging thing. I think, there are two things. There's memorial, there's physical memorial itself, there's the message of the exhibition. And I think, to be perfectly honest, this goes back to development several years ago, and maybe some of the political reaction to the memorial project. There's been this sense that somehow that either it will just tell this incredibly celebratory narrative, weren't we great, or somehow it will be saying, weren't we terrible? And I think, that's not what this is about. And Sir Richard is an incredible historian who has done more than almost anybody to broaden our understanding of Nazi Germany. I think, this is ultimately a debate which every country has to have. And Germany is the supreme example of that. Germany is the country which I would say more than any other, I would say possibly is the only country that has fully confronted its legacy when it comes to the Holocaust, honestly, in public life. And it's not about embarrassment. We're not doing this for national pride. We're doing this because it's important. And nobody should feel proud of their country because of the Holocaust. But equally, nobody should be made to feel ashamed because of something that earlier generations did. Professor Yehuda Bauer, who is in his mid-90s now and still this incredible source of wisdom, who's one of the leading historians of the Holocaust, and has spent a lot of the last few years engaging with the issue of Holocaust distortion, always says, it's not about saying some countries are bad and other countries are good. Everybody has dirty hands when it comes to the Holocaust. It's the murder of 6 million people. And therefore, all we can do, if we want to actually gain anything from this history and to honor the people who were murdered, is to try to be as honest as we possibly can. And for all sorts of reasons, in all sorts of countries, that proves often a very difficult thing to do. But I think I can say for everybody who's involved in this project that there was a very sincere desire to address those nuances and to be as honest and as sensitive as we can, and not to tell people what to think.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to take one final question and then hand back to Barnabas. So there are many Holocaust memorials around the world, but anti-Semitism continues, unfortunately, to rise both here in the UK and around the world, as we have seen recently. Can memorials play a part in combating anti-Semitism?
They can play a part, but I mean, of course, no memorial is going to stop anti-Semitism, and education is not going to stop anti-Semitism. It'd be wonderful if it could, but I think, you know, the course of human history and the example of the Holocaust itself shows that in and of themselves, actions by states, by educators or whoever, will not necessarily eliminate prejudice, will not necessarily eliminate violence. All we can again do, I think, is to strive to do the best that we can. If someone is an anti-Semite, I think sadly, they're probably not going to change their mind. And I think particularly now we live in an era where it's really difficult, because we've essentially, I was thinking about this the other day, we've essentially invented tools for people to brainwash themselves, where algorithms will actually reinforce their prejudices. So we're not going to eliminate anti-Semitism. I mean, in Europe, anti-Semitism as a sort of very active and malignant presence has existed for, 1,000 years at least. And there have been waves where it's grown, where it's diminished, but it's always been there. But what we can do, I think, is to try to empower people to acknowledge anti-Semitism, to understand it, and therefore potentially to be more willing to take a stand against it. It's going to be a part of the exhibition content. We have to address the history of anti-Semitism. To understand the Holocaust, we have to address Britain's own history of anti-Semitism. One of the longest lasting anti-Semitic tropes, the blood libel, was first, as far as anyone is aware, was first made in Norwich in 1144. And the blood libel is still with us today. I mean, you only need to look at QAnon, which is the blood libel sort of repackaged as Trump fan fiction. And if people can recognize why that is anti-Semitic, because it may not necessarily be obvious, then I think that's part of the fight against it. And I would love to say, we will free the world of anti-Semitism and racism and violence, but we can just try to do what we can. And I think ultimately that's the most that we can hope for.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll all continue to try our best and everything, but I guess there is really only so much we can do. Well, thank you so much for
Thank you, Eloise, and again,
really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And I pass back to Barnabas to close the event.
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you, Martin. That's been an incredible discussion. We've covered so much, and it's been wonderful to have such an in-depth discussion about all the different things, as well as an insight into this future memorial that we look forward to seeing. People often think of the Holocaust as something that happened in a faraway country a long time ago, but today through this discussion, you've told us and you've shown us the connections that the UK had to the Holocaust, be that through British victims of the Holocaust, through the British role in Mandate Palestine, and the British internment of so-called enemy aliens. And I think this has been incredibly helpful for us to really frame our understanding of the Holocaust and its connections to our country. We're very grateful to you for sharing your expertise with us and for sharing an insight into the memorial and what we can look forward to seeing. And I'd like to close by thanking yourself, Martin, thanking you, Eloise, for leading us in the discussion, and thanking everyone who's attended today and asked questions. Good night.